Millions of people visit Florida every year looking for paradise. Most of them end up in exactly the same places: Miami, Key West, Clearwater. But here's the strange part. Some of Florida's most beautiful places never became famous at all. They have water that looks like the Caribbean, beaches without high-rise hotels, and coastlines that still feel almost untouched. So why didn't they become the next Miami? The answer is different every time. One place was spared because the military used the land before developers ever could. Another survived because local residents stopped a bridge from being built. One became protected after a devastating hurricane changed its future. And another simply formed too late for anyone to build on it. Together, they tell a story most people never realize. Florida didn't have just one future. It had two. These 5 places ended up on the other path. Cape San Blas, St. Joseph Peninsula. Cape San Blas keeps showing up on Best Beaches in America lists, which is a strange thing for a place almost nobody outside Florida can find on a map. It's a thin curl of land hanging off the Panhandle pine scrub on one side, dunes tall enough to block the Gulf from view until you're standing on top of them. And here's where the why actually starts. Most of this peninsula spent the 1940s as U.S. Army land, used for bombing and gunnery training during World War II. It wasn't beautiful by accident that it stayed empty. It was federally restricted. When the military didn't need it anymore, the land went to the state instead of a developer. And in 1967, it became St. Joseph Peninsula State Park, locking up most of the peninsula before Florida's resort boom ever got close enough to bid on it. Gulf County itself never fought hard for that boom either. It's one of the least populated counties on the Gulf Coast, and the people who do live here have spent decades quietly resisting the kind of zoning changes that turn a quiet cape into a corridor of condos. Ask a longtime resident what they think about a high-rise hotel going up on the Cape, and you'll usually get the same answer: a flat no, then a story about a cousin who sold their place in Destin and regretted it within a year. Why don't most Americans know it exists? Partly because Panhandle itself reads as the unglamorous part of Florida. It doesn't have a nickname like the Space Coast or the Treasure Coast, so it never had a tourism board pushing it the way Destin or Panama City got pushed. The reward for the lack of attention is sand, made almost entirely of fine white quartz, which doesn't hold heat or stain, so sunlight bounces straight back up through the shallows instead of getting absorbed, pale green close in, sharpening to deep blue further out, in bands you can actually trace from the dune line. Picture standing on top of one of those dunes right before sunset, wind strong enough to flatten the seagrass, the tide pulling back and leaving dark glassy strips on the sand below. No music, no other group in sight, just a hawk riding the wind over the old military scrub behind you. It's not hidden because it's hard to reach. It's hidden because the Army got there first, and the state never let go. 3 Rooker Island. 3 Rooker Island has a strange excuse for staying undeveloped. It's almost too young to have ever been developed in the first place. The sandbar that became this island didn't actually break the surface until the 1980s. By the time it had stabilized enough for plants to take root in the 1990s, every other piece of buildable Gulf Coast real estate near Tampa Bay had already been claimed, built on, and sold. 3 Rooker simply missed the entire era when Florida was handing out waterfront permits. By the time it existed, it landed inside the boundary of Anclote Key Preserve State Park instead, protected specifically because it had become one of the few stable nesting sites left for black skimmers and other shorebirds that had nowhere else to go. That timing is the whole story. There was no resident uprising here, no zoning fight, just a piece of land that showed up too late to the party and got claimed by conservation before anyone with a permit application could get there first. It also explains why so few people outside the boating community have heard of it. It's not on any historic map, it's not in any old guidebook, and it's young enough that most of Tampa's own tourism marketing was already locked in around Clearwater Beach and San Pete decades before 3 Rooker was stable enough to stand on. Geologically, it's still a barrier sandbar, built and rebuilt constantly by tide and storm, never quite permanent, which is exactly why nothing's ever been allowed to be built on it. At low tide, a long, pale spit of sand opens up out of the water, turquoise close in, deepening to navy where the channel drops. Picture wading out at low tide, water barely past your knees the whole way, gulls scattering ahead of you, while Clearwater's hotel skyline sits in clear view the entire walk, close enough to see, completely irrelevant to where you're standing. The strange part isn't that it's untouched, it's that it arrived too late to be touched at all. Keewaydin Island. Keewaydin sits directly across the water from Naples, one of the most expensive zip codes in the country, and the reason nobody built on it isn't subtle. People stopped it on purpose. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, while Marco Island just to the south was being bulldozed and rebuilt into the high-rise resort town it is today, the state had plans to do the same thing to Keewaydin. A bridge, a road, and eventually the same wall of condominiums. Local residents weren't on board. Around 1,000 of them signed a petition to stop the bridge before it was ever built, citing exactly the pattern they'd watched happen up and down the rest of Florida's barrier islands. They won. The bridge was never built, and without a bridge, there was no road for a developer to follow. That single decision is the entire reason Keewaydin looks the way it does today. 8 miles of barrier island, mangrove tunnels, gumbo limbo trees, gopher tortoises, and somewhere around 85% of it now owned by the state as part of the Rooker Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, with a small cluster of grandfathered private homes still tucked along the shoreline. The residents who live out there now, the ones with no roads, no power grid, no choice but a boat, most of them will tell you they like it that way, precisely because of what didn't happen here. Why don't most people in Naples even think about it? Because the city's own image is built around golf courses and Fifth Avenue shopping, not an undeveloped island a mile offshore. The marketing pointed inland, so the island simply stayed out of frame. Picture gliding out of a mangrove tunnel into open water just as the light shifts, shade to full sun in about 3 seconds. A manatee's back breaking the surface off to your left, nothing ahead but green water and white birds. Naples spent 70 years building a reputation on things people built. The most Caribbean-looking water in the county is the one piece of land 1,000 signatures decided nobody would touch. Bahia Honda State Park. Most people driving to Key West treat the rest of the Keys as scenery on the way to the real destination. Bahia Honda is the one spot that should make them pull over, and the reason it's still quiet has nothing to do with luck. The old Bahia Honda Bridge once carried Henry Flagler's overseas railroad until the 1935 hurricane that ended the line for good. When the state converted the wreckage into a highway bridge, the original truss span turned out to be too narrow to widen for 2 lanes of traffic. So, instead of tearing it down, engineers built an entirely new bridge alongside it in 1972 and left the old one standing as a ruin. That ruin became part of Bahia Honda State Park, which had already been protecting the surrounding land since 1961. Development never got a foothold here because the land was locked into conservation more than a decade before the modern Keys tourism boom even started. What that means today, no resort chain ever got the chance to buy this stretch, because by the time the Keys became a destination, this particular key was already off the market. Most travelers never find out it's here because the entire Keys brand is built around Key West, specifically the bars, the sunset crowd, the buoy marking the southernmost point. Bahia Honda doesn't have a single iconic photo op to put in a thumbnail, so it just never got pulled into the same orbit. The water itself rivals the outer Bahamas, turtlegrass flats, giving way to open sandy patches, visibility deep enough to watch your own shadow several feet down. The shallow flats barely move. There's no real surf to stir up sediment, so the color just sits there, glowing most of the day. Picture wading out with the old rail bridge looming overhead like the skeleton of something much bigger than the island itself. Water going from ankle deep to chest deep in a slow, even slope, a barracuda hanging motionless in the grass nearby, completely uninterested in you. It's 15 minutes off the main highway. It's also the one stretch of the Keys that got protected before anyone thought to build a hotel on it. Shell Key Preserve. Shell Key sits just south of Sanit Pete Beach, one of the most heavily Instagrammed beaches in the state, and the contrast across that channel might be the most literal two futures moment in Florida. The history here is almost funny. Shell Key, as an actual island, didn't really exist until the 1960s. It started as scattered underwater sandbars, slowly built itself into a connected shoreline through the 1970s and 1980s, and wasn't fully formed until around 1990. By the time it was solid enough to put a house on, Pinellas County had already started buying up the surrounding land on purpose, using a voter-approved conservation sales tax specifically to keep barrier islands like this one undeveloped. The county finalized a long-term lease with the state in 2000, formally turning it into a wildlife preserve built around nesting, shorebirds, and sea turtles. In other words, Residents of Pinellas County voted with their own tax dollars to make sure nobody could build here. That's not a passive accident of geography. That's a county actively deciding Paradise should stay empty. Why doesn't the average tourist on San Pete Beach know it's right there? Because there's no bridge, no sign, no way to stumble onto it by driving, and a few hundred yards of open water turns out to be a far more effective filter than any marketing campaign could ever be. The color comes from the same formula as everywhere else on this list. Pale sand, shallow water, barely any wave action, but the contrast here is what sells it. Beach umbrellas, packed shoulder to shoulder on one side, total quiet on the other, separated by a single channel you can paddle across in minutes. Picture pushing off at sunrise before the wind picks up, water flat as glass, an osprey folding into a dive off the bow, San Pete's hotel towers sitting right there on the horizon the entire time, visible, almost audible, and yet completely beside the point. If there's a theme running through all 5 of these, it's this. None of them stayed quiet by accident. A petition stopped one, a tax stopped another. A War Department, a hurricane, and a stubborn sandbar's own slow timeline did the rest. Florida didn't run out of places that could have become Miami. It just had a handful of moments where somebody, the state, the residents, the calendar itself said no.